I'm Mark Trahant, the editor of Indian Country Today. Indian Country Today has an open invitation to all the presidential candidates, including President Donald Trump, to come to our studios to talk about the issues that impact Indian country. We're starting this series today with Montana Governor Steve Bullock, who's making history. He is the first presidential candidate to ever do an interview in a newsroom, or in this case, a studio, of a native newspaper. We are here at our home at the Walter Cronkite School of Journalism at Arizona State University. And I want to start by acknowledging the homeland of the O'odham people. Governor Bullock, you're not new to Indian country. I remember meeting you at Fort Belknap a few years ago as you toured all of Montana's reservations. That's a tough trip, a lot of miles. Why is it so important to visit Indian country?
Yeah, and it really is. I mean, Montana is the home of 7 federally recognized, 8 including the Little Shell, tribal nations. And I've been in office for about 10 years. And through that time, first was Attorney General, then as governor. Learned through that about sort of the government-to-government relationships, the importance of actually coming to the tribal nation seats of government as much as I asked them to come to Helena. So I think that sort of the rich tapestry of our state, and it's amazing. So I was raised in Montana, and when my children were in 5th grade, they knew more about our tribal nations than I did growing up the whole time because of Indian Education for All. But to make sure that sort of that rich tapestry of the state is fully recognized, I can't do that from my office in Helena alone. I need to actually be visiting the tribal nations, both in a formal capacity at times, but also the informal as well.
Well, and I didn't want to start with Indian Education for All, but since you brought it up, you really can't know the history of this country without knowing Indian country history, and yet it's so missing from the discourse.
No, it really is. And I think, I've seen in Montana, because we had on the one hand, you had a constitutional obligation or right to have Indian Education for All, but it had never been funded until probably about 15 years ago. And just the change in understanding of everyone in our state as a result of it has really changed, I think, sort of the overall complexion of our state.
Well, and when you first enter the state capitol and you're greeted with the tribal flags, the symbols of welcoming are right there from the beginning. And we think of the White House where you hope to go, and it's Andrew Jackson and the symbols
right.
of not exactly welcoming.
Yeah, that's right, Mark. And like in my governor's reception room, the flags of all of our tribal nations are right next to the U.S. and the Montana flag. And even this time, this past legislature got approved, and we're going out for bid right now. We'll have the flags of all of our tribal nations now flying in front of our state capitol as well. And it's amazing when I have visitors, often from around the world, in this beautiful, ornate reception room that's part of the governor's office. And at the end of like a meeting, we'll always line up for pictures. And they'll be saying, well, what are all those flags? So sort of the last history lesson they learned from our state capitol is learning about our tribal nations and their contributions to our state and the unique relationships that we have.
Well, and it's worth noting that Montana has the highest percentage of Native legislators in the country. And it's partly for that welcoming and good districting.
We do. And it was actually this last legislative session was the largest caucus. I think it was 12 members, which really makes a difference along the way. It's not without, like my legislature's always been the whole time I've been there now it's about 60% Republican. It was about 2/3 when I came in. But having the voices there from the communities, from the tribal nations that can speak to some of the challenges. I think it makes our overall body, the legislative body, that much better, for sure.
One of the things that I've heard you talk about before is in the Native community, we talk a lot about the Native vote and making sure the Native vote means something. But you've seen it from the other side where it actually did mean something. I think you said something about 100-1 in some communities.
Yeah, there was one precinct where it literally was 100 and some to 2 or 3 votes. And one of the tribal leaders who will go unnamed said, I wonder who those few were, right? Because it is one of these that, we know in the political system talk is cheap, right? That people talk a lot, but they don't actually try to address the challenges and the real opportunities. And that was, when I was Attorney General, it was interesting. One of the lessons that I got, and it was from Crow, someone said, we always see you elected officials and you want to be elected officials around election day, but then we don't ever see you again. And that really changed to make sure that, for me, this wasn't about campaigns. This was about creating greater opportunity for everyone in our state.
Well, in the opportunity arena, again, Montana, people don't know the Montana story as well as they should, but everything from weights and measures boards to poet laureate, there are natives in jobs that you wouldn't expect throughout the state architecture.
Yeah, and one of the things, actually the person that heads up all my boards and appointments is Little Shell. And there was, I think, at one point in Montana, this view, well, we've got to make sure to have Native American representation on those Native American related boards. But we are so much better for any agency. I don't care if you're doing weights and measures. Certainly on our higher education, we have someone from CSKT, but every single one of the boards and appointments, like I'll get a regular record as we're looking at who we're appointing and sort of, I ask for, well, how many Native Americans do we have on this? Because we're only going to be that much better if it really is, if Native American representation is all throughout state government and all throughout the boards and appointments.
Well, how do you apply that to the federal government? I mean, the Plum Book, the last time I looked, the Obama administration had a high of maybe 6 jobs.
Yeah, and I think that you have to look at that it really does become that much better for all of government, the more inclusion that we can have. And it's even one of these, yes, I have my Office of Indian Affairs, but to say that should be all that, we do would be so selling all the opportunities behind. So we actually have, and I've thought about this at the federal level too, we have a sub-cabinet because every one of my state agencies has something to do with Native Americans and has something to do with the tribal nations. So on a regular basis, not just necessarily the head of that agency, but everyone's assigned to have some folks that are just going to get together, every couple of months and say, what are both the challenges and opportunities in Indian country? And I think doing that alone helps change parts of the overall discussion of how government can better serve. But it's also then, I want my government to reflect actually the people in the state. And it's actually probably a disproportionate representation, a greater Native American representation than even the 7% that is the state of Montana, because I think that only creates a better government.
But if you look at over time, it's still way short. So a long ways to go.
It is. And it's always certainly, and at the federal level, though, that I think that, we often look at, the Bureau of Indian Affairs will take care of all of the Native American related issues. I think there's 20 different federal agencies that have some impact on Indian country. And there's got to be a better coordinating function to make sure that every one of those agencies are thinking about what we're doing for our First Americans.
Well, the actual lowest percentage, I think, of any federal agency is the judiciary. And there's one Article 3 judge in the entire system.
Is that right?
Yeah, here in Phoenix.
I'll be darned. Yeah, because that's also one of the problems, too, when you look at, I look at the Supreme Court often and I say that everybody on that court is essentially from the East Coast. It's hard to really have a good understanding of American Indian issues or Western issues or water law issues if you have no direct connection to that. So I wasn't aware of from the Article 3 judges, but that's something that we do need to increase.
Probably one of the areas that I think you've been most successful as a governor that is a conversation missing in the country is Medicaid and how to make Medicaid work for both Democrats and Republicans. One part of that discussion that even Congress, I think, is missing is that Medicaid is now as important as the Indian Health Service in straight funding and how it serves. And I had a relative actually in Montana whose husband had cancer, and said, I didn't have to wait for it to be a category 3.
No, that's right. That's right. And, it's interesting. When I first took office, I did a health improvement plan for the entire state saying, how do we improve the health outcomes, right, for everyone in Montana? And realized at that point, if you're native in Montana, on average, you're living 20 years less. So that's not just healthcare, right? That's education, that's economic opportunity, that's food security. But when we looked at Medicaid, both expanding Medicaid not only allows, there are 15,000, about of the 100,000 that we expanded healthcare to with it, about 15,000 are Native Americans, not necessarily on a reservation, but exactly that. We went from the IHS was life and limb, and the funding was typically just for life and limb. And by having this money coming in, you're doing a lot more both preventative. You're not waiting the 3 months. And I think it really has changed opportunities for healthcare in Indian country. And it's also what's great is that's another example of the partnerships where every one of our tribal nations were up at the state capitol because we got it passed in 2015 the first time, tried to reauthorize by ballot initiative. Tobacco companies spent $26 million killing that ballot reauthorization. But every one of our tribal nations stood strong in saying we need to get this through for the health and for our economy.
As president, how would you address, certainly on this campaign cycle, folks have been talking about Medicare for all, and yet Medicaid may be one of the most efficient programs the country's ever invented.
Well, and especially like in a state like ours too, because I think we're the only state in the country that actually has coverage for both dental and vision as well. I think that we should begin with a base assumption that everyone should have access to affordable, quality health care. And there's a number of different ways that we can get there. I'm one that says let's build on the system that we have, that the Affordable Care Act, which includes the Medicaid expansion, was the largest expansion of health care since we passed Medicare. So let's build on that with a public option, with negotiating prescription drug prices, with ending surprise medical billing, with starting to change payment structures so we're paying doctors to keep people well, not just repeated tests. But it's an interesting time because even in the disparity of sort of the difference of opinions within the Democratic primary, we're not talking about the fact that Republicans in the Trump administration have now tried 70 times to get rid of the Affordable Care Act, which would also get rid of coverage for pre-existing conditions, which would get rid of the Medicaid expansion. And we need to certainly build and improve on what we have, but also recognize that there's somebody out there and a party out there that's trying to take it away from us.
What happens if the court does their dirty work for them?
In striking down the Affordable Care Act,
right.
I would love to believe, because I've even with Democratic and Republican governors gone to Washington, D.C. to say, here's how you can improve it. I would love to believe that this Congress now recognizes what a difference it makes for the entire country. Like when I was trying to expand Medicaid, because some folks want to turn around and say, well, this is just like health care for individuals that are unwilling to work hard enough. I said, well, I got about 7 of my 10 in the expansion population that are working. Then I took it one step further. 57% of every business in my state has one or more Medicaid enrollees. So they're just unwilling or unable to pay enough to get quality health care. I think what it would do to communities large and small all across this country is so significant that I'd love to think the Congress isn't so broken that they'd actually reauthorize it. But that's another reason why I think that, candidly, we need somebody new in the White House and we need a new Congress.
It'd probably be only the urban areas and the rural areas that'd be impacted.
Well, and you look at, 20% of our rural hospitals are at risk of closing right now. And in Montana, we haven't lost one rural hospital. In part, it's because of that Medicaid expansion. It so struck me when we were trying to get through the first time where a hospital administrator said, 44% of the people that walk through these doors don't have health insurance. And if you don't have coverage, you're also waiting until, the problems are at the worst as opposed to getting preventative care. So I think we have to both, my perspective is build on what we have, deal with costs, deal with making sure that everybody has access. Boy, if you could even expand Medicaid to, I think it's the 22 states that don't have it, that'd be another about 15 million people covered with health care.
Is the definition of poverty adequate for Medicaid?
Candidly, I don't think that the definition of poverty is adequate for any of our services. And you look, because it really is the working poor that is still in Montana and across the country getting coverage. But I think that should be upped for sure.
Speaking of, well, maybe not working poor, but certainly folks looking out for the future, probably no industry is in as much turmoil as coal. And you have families who, no fault of their own, are going through a transition to something that they don't know what it is. Here in Arizona, there's a big one going on right now. What do you tell those families about the future for coal and those industries?
Well, I think being from the West, we know our fire seasons are 78 days longer than they were 30, 40 years ago. Being outdoors people, we know that the climate's changing. We have to take action, and we have to take immediate and durable action. When globally the scientists say, the IPCC says, we have to be net zero as a world by 2050. I think we could do it like America 2040 or even earlier. But your point is exactly one where I think too often when Democrats are talking about the steps that we need to take to address climate change, they make people that have lived their whole life powering this country somehow sound like they're the problem. So I think that we can't leave communities behind as we do this. We have Colstrip in eastern Montana. When HAFO was announced a slate to close, one of the things that we did is we did get a $5.6 million planning grant to say not just at a greater level of planning, but how do we help those individual employees? We passed got a guy named Senator Jason Small, a Republican senator, actually sponsored a bill that we signed that said when we're going to start doing cleanup in those areas, there should be not only prevailing wage, but the skilled workers from the actual area. Right. And I think that we have to look at this. People say it's a climate crisis. It is, but we have to look at it as a climate opportunity to create good jobs in this transition, not leave communities behind.
Wow, the cleanup jobs could be significant for years to come.
No, I absolutely can, Mark.
The flip side of that on climate change is really, in one way, there's only one question, and is how much do you want to spend on mitigation versus adaptation? And at what point do we say it's time to start spending real money on adaptation?
Well, I think that on the one hand, you can't do one versus the other. You have to be able to adapt. You have to have resilient communities. But that's I think of like the first George Bush, when he was in office, he said, we're going to address the greenhouse effect with the White House effect. Here was a Republican president that said, climate change is real. We have to do something about it. And now, fast forward to today, the Republican Party is literally the only major political party in the world that does acknowledge that climate change is human impacted and it's real. So I don't ever want to get to a point of saying, well, we can forgo mitigation by dealing with adaptation. Because if so, what we're handing off, as you know so well, that as so many tribal nations talk about 7 generations forward and 7 generations back, we can't even go one more generation without addressing climate.
Shifting gears, one of the other success stories, I think, in Montana is tribal colleges, and not just the educational side, but the business side and how they impact the community's economy.
Yeah. So we have 7 tribal colleges, I think more than any other state. It was interesting. I don't remember. So this is my 7th year as governor. But the Board of Regents, which oversees our public universities, and the tribal college presidents had never even gotten together. And indeed, until a couple of years ago, not even all the tribal colleges had gotten together. So I've really tried to make any facet of economic development to include our tribal colleges because they're such an incredible asset, not just for the community, but for the state. We're the first in the nation in 5 of the 7 tribal colleges. I started with grant funding. We started apprenticeship programs so that there could be a job while someone's working and the job is meeting a need directly on that campus. We just got through in the CHAP program, the Community Health Aid Program. We're the first state, even though this program's been around since the 1950s, that got both behavioral health, physical health, and dental health as well. Celebrated with a Fort Belknap as we signed that bill. And what both the tribal colleges can create is that stability of anchor in a community. It can be a real economic driver for the community, but it's also an economic driver even for the greater region. Like we pay non-beneficiary dollars, so any student that wants to go to a tribal college, then that the state will pick up a good chunk of that cost just to try to get folks there. And it's not even the college. We finally got, I find that every time I go to Indian country, I learn more than I give. And it was one meeting, I can't remember which of our tribal nations, but they said, we used to actually get money from the state for GED or high-set training so that we could actually, for any of our kids that drop out of school, and nationally, as far as high school graduation attainment, I think it's lower for Native Americans than any other group or class. And they said, whatever happened to that money? I said, well, that should be an easy thing to get. So someone can get at least the equivalency of a high school degree. So then they're going to go on to college.
And those programs actually save the state money almost immediately.
No, they absolutely do. They absolutely do. And so much of this is coordination too. I mean, and it was the tribal nations that came to me, well, yes, we have Medicaid. Yes, you have Indian Health Services. But they said, you, Bullock, or you, the state of Montana, really have to focus on everything that you can do on a healthcare. So we started, after consultations, started the Office of American Indian Health in our state government. Well, it's not the state of Montana's obligation or opportunity to take the lead, but anything that we can do to help coordinate those, just as we've tried to do with higher education, I think it makes everybody that much better off.
So should you move to Washington, what would you tell the secretaries of education and HHS about that kind of coordination and what's needed?
Well, first I'd replace the secretaries of HHS and education. And I think that's part of what I learned when we sort of set up the sub-cabinet is that, first of all, like you turn around and say a Department of Education, there's about $180 million that's dedicated to Indian education. I think that should be doubled just right from the get-go. And that's not counting like Title I money and other things like that. But I think that there could be so much greater coordination all throughout the federal government when it comes to Indian country. I mean, it should be, with proper consultation, it should almost be the task forces saying, how can we wake up each day and say, among this disparate, huge federal government, how can we do like we've tried to do in Montana and say, how can we make sure that resources are being dedicated and the conversations are being had so it's not just someone that is disconnected from our tribal nations to actually address some of the challenges and opportunities in Indian country?
Well, now's the time you look at the demographics, and Indian country is so young as the country is growing older. To have that be more educated now is in the country's interest.
It is. And it's education. It is economic development. Like we started, there are unique challenges of starting a business if most of the land's held in trust. Like we start a collateral program where if a young entrepreneur or older entrepreneur wants to start a business and needs a loan, well, the state of Montana will provide the collateral for that. And we haven't had one default yet through that. And I think that's, to your initial point of educational growth means not only educational opportunity, but economic opportunity. And that's how you build communities that much greater and better. So that's got to be a platform as long as you also have basic health, basic housing met, food security issues met. And with that then, because I think our tribal colleges are also the incubators of business ideas. Both Indian country for the most part, and our country is founded on the small businesses, the people that come up and say, all right, I'm going to start this business with the hope of growing.
And one dimension I don't think people understand is with tribal businesses, particularly enterprises, you take out the profit incentive where it's trying to be self-sustaining more than to actually return to a shareholder.
No.
And so they're putting money back into the community in really strong ways.
Yeah. Like I think of SKC Technologies as an example.
Exactly.
And both what it's been able to do in Department of Defense, giving them cutting edge contracts, incredible training opportunities. But that's exactly it. The money then goes back to the community. It's not stock buybacks and shareholder profits and things like that.
So as you go across the country, and I think not just here, but I've seen you on different networks talking about Native issues when it's not even been on the agenda. What's kind of your message to the country about some of the issues you've learned in Montana?
Well, boy, there's a lot of messages that I've learned. And when I first announced in Iowa on my first trip, I went to the Meskwaki Nation because I think it was important for that connection. Just both the rich underpinning of our nation is so founded on the opportunities still in Indian country, but also there's an obligation there. I mean, I never forget when I first started getting into it that in public office, like I'd go and meet with a tribal council and somebody would start talking about what happened 150 years ago. And initially my frustration was, I can't do anything about 150 years ago. But as I matured, I realized if I don't understand what happened 150 years ago, there's no way I'm ever going to be able to be effective in my job today. And you have to recognize both the cultural appropriation, that like we were the first state in the country that started state dollars going into language preservation. Because for so many of our tribal nations, you've been stripped of your language. Now it's just the elders. And that language is part of keeping the culture and keeping the sort of the cohesiveness of that tribal nation, as just but one example. So I think that anybody stepping into the office of president hopefully will have the appreciation of what incredible opportunities we have in the Indian country. But if you think that you just address it by saying, here are the challenges of 2019, you're missing the boat. You have to recognize that so many of these challenges are historically ingrained, and you have to address them in that way.
The other thing, and like you, I travel a lot to different places across Indian country, and I'm always blown away by the sheer amount of talent.
Yeah.
Undiscovered talent.
In so many different ways, right? In so many different ways. And that's always, I've had those moments where, and even taken my children and the experiences that they've had of, it's not just a cultural or a bygone relic, the talent in everything from some of the brightest people I've met, some of the best athletes, some of the most culturally and ecologically aware. It's every time, if you do it right, you walk out a little bit richer than you walked in.
Thanks. Let me wrap this up by just asking about nation to nation and how, as president, you would ensure that works.
Well, and I think that we really need to, and because it doesn't always work, certainly at the federal government. There became trust obligations when 400 million acres of land were essentially taken away, and 375 treaties that have been passed over the history actually have to be recognized. And it's something that, as a sovereign to sovereign, as a governor, I completely not only respect, but I think it makes both governments better. And at the federal level, when you look at this, first of all, you have to begin with baseline consultation. I mean, we can't have respect for one another if I'm going to tell you what to do, Mark, right? And this is institutionalized, that nation-to-nation consultation must occur. And that's from everything from environmental actions to educational actions. I was asked initially, like, well, where's your plan for Indian country? And I can talk about a whole lot of things that I'd like to do. And I can look at sort of the broken promises, what the Commission of Civil Rights said, looking from 2018 to 15 years later, that the funding never happened. But if you're actually going to have a real plan for Indian country, you can talk about what you want to do as a candidate. But if you're not actually doing nation-to-nation consultation and saying, we build this together, then you probably don't fully understand or appreciate the importance of making sure that a government-to-government consultation is what creates a path forward for us both.
Thank you, Governor.
Thank you very much, Mark.